So, welcome to this episode of the Rule Breakers podcast, and I'm delighted to have with me Edd Wilder-James today, someone I have known for decades at this stage, mostly electronically, but I do remember meeting you in an airport in Philadelphia many, many moons ago, which I think might have been the first time that I met you. But I'll drag it out of my memory in a second here, Edd. But let me start by saying thank you very much for doing this, and it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk with you.
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, I think that would have been XML 99 in Philadelphia that we were there
Philadelphia, yeah,
Yeah,
in the
my
airport.
first XML conference.
I think I'd come across your name prior to that. I think maybe you were on the XML, the XML dev mailing list. Were you?
That's right. Yes, the way I got into it is kind of amusing and actually shaped the rest of my career in some ways. As XML came out and was a big thing. I was, a software developer at the National News Agency at the time. And I remember being excited by it and thinking, well, this thing needs a blog, and staying up all night after having the idea while washing up and creating a blog called XML Hack. And that's how I also met Simon St. Laurent, who I think you've spoken to as well. Just,
Indeed.
It's someone who's talking a lot. Would you like to do this with me?
I associate, at least the early part of my memories of you, anyway, I associate with O'Reilly book publishing. I see a bunch of O'Reilly books behind you, and the whole DocBook thing. You were involved in that?
That's right. So what happened was we started this new blog on XML, and we were not angry young men, but certainly opinionated young men at the time. And about 3 weeks after we'd got this up and running, Dale Doherty, who was at O'Reilly at the time and largely responsible for, the early commercial success of publishing on the internet in the US, basically called me up and said, would you like to edit XML.com? We've got a big, the bigger industry thing going there, sight unseen. And I said, yes. And that's what ended up taking me into the community, really, and started off, I think, a 20-something year long relationship with O'Reilly as well.
And were you involved in this is back in the days, the early days of the transition to online publishing for O'Reilly? Was it away from the physical books? I see you have lots of them on the shelf behind you. Is that about when you came in?
Yeah, I mean, I was more involved in the conference scene as it sort of went on. But early on, actually, when we were publishing on XML.com, I did do some work. We had Unix Power Tools, which you might remember as a very thick volume, probably what happened. Printed out an early version of Stack Overflow almost. It was that kind of a book. And we had this idea to take the DocBook and, convert this and turn it all into kind of like a big online thing, so yeah, I did there, and that's how I met Norm Walsh at the time as well. Yeah. So I played around in those waters, but I was more on the editorial side.
Right. My first encounter with O'Reilly books, I think, was a 3-volume set of the X11 APIs back in the days when there was an MIT consortium, and coming out of the Unix world, I guess this thing came from this idea that maybe there's a new version of kind of client server, that's not mainframe, that's graphical and so on. It's kind of weird where we are now is that that whole vision has actually come to pass, except it's come to pass in a new form. We've essentially finally got to the point where I think pretty much anything that you could have done using X11, you can now probably do on a Canvas element in a browser.
It's true. I feel like we keep this, there are enduring models that we keep re-implementing in different ways. And, the only thing that's slightly disarming now about doing things in Canvas and JavaScript is you don't want to look over the edge of the cliff and see what everything is piled on top of.
Right.
We could have fit it on a floppy disk.
Yeah. It is a large dependency graph, that's for sure. But anyone who's using, say, an Ubuntu desktop machine, it's just ironic to me that here is a system that is, has got X11 underneath, And 17 layers further up, it's got the concept of a browser, which is essentially reinventing a whole bunch of things that X11 can do, that can do 17
Yeah.
layers further down.
Speaking of Simon, that's the way we always used to talk about this technology as sort of, it's like stacked teacups. Every layer of abstraction doesn't quite fit with the previous, but it's amazing what we can do.
Yeah. I think, was it Murray Maloney? Did Murray Maloney have a role in both, or I think the reason why the W3C consortium ended up in MIT might have something to do with what had previously happened with the X11 one. I don't know the history there, to be honest.
Yes, nor do I, to be honest. I mean, that's where Tim was, of course, anyway. So
Right, yeah. But I mean, DocBook, looking back on it now, I mean, I still come across DocBook on a regular basis, not for book printing publishing, but for example, in the world that I work in, which is a lot of legal and accounting type material, we still come across situations where people who they initially used it for CD-ROMs, so create all of your XML in DocBook, and then use some sort of publishing engine to get to something like Folio Views, which was a popular browsing technology that predates, modern browsers, but had a really, really powerful search engine, I remember. But we still come across people who use it, but not in its CD-ROM form, but they generate the so-called info bases, and then they put them up on network drives and then, access it that way. So yeah, it's interesting how these technologies, when they come along, sometimes they find a way to evolve with the next generation and end up getting baked under the floorboards and, continue on for generations afterwards.
Well, they were, I think, especially, good ideas endure, and DocBook, I think, is an extremely well-designed vocabulary. Felt pretty ergonomic to use. I always have fond memories of it, which I can't say always for a lot of the
Right.
markup. Another enduring one would be like the Emacs info
Right.
formats, which I don't like at all. So
Right.
it was well put together, and brings me in mind of, a lot of the people I met early in XML were not computer scientists, and that made it all a lot better. Had a lot of liberal arts majors and so on. And so I think the group of folks that looked after DocBook called themselves the Davenport group, if I'm correct.
I remember that name.
Yeah, just these very evocative names that we just kind of lost now. Everything's like, Jason or Tom or something thrusting and abbreviated.
Yeah. It is. It struck me as always interesting to go to XML conferences and SGML conferences before them for that reason, because you get this really interesting mix of people. You might have someone whose expertise is, 15th century, medieval poetry or something, besides someone whose job in life is, the technical manuals for an aircraft carrier. And a very interesting mix of people who would go to those events.
Oh, yes. And who else did I remember? Leora Alschuler was somebody who I really enjoyed meeting, and it was health, health data exchange was her thing. And I forget his last name now, but the gentleman who was a biblical scholar who would cart everything around with him in this sort of cart around the conference hall. Patrick, I forget his other name.
Is it Durso?
I think that sounds. Yes, that's correct. Yeah. Just a mishmash of extremely nice and rather eccentric people.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. And not the kind of folks who would normally, have any reason to be in the same conference room together, completely different reasons for being there, but just, joined together by this concept. I remember, a chemist, talking about a markup language for chemistry, and then, the text encoding initiative, agonizing over exactly what Shakespeare did or didn't mean by, all sorts of just bizarre, but fascinating conversations about the pros and cons of separating content from presentation and, what you can and cannot do.
It was a rare thing. I don't think I realized, like many things, how good it was at the time. I look back and think how lucky we were as well, in that of all the computing communities, it was the most diverse and gender balanced
right
community to be in. Things we're still struggling to achieve, which it was a luxury for that to be like my first large technical community.
I do miss those days, just going along to those conferences and just, obviously, it's typical of conferences, I guess, is you get a certain amount from the official program, but you get so much more from the people that you just
Yeah.
bump into around the coffee machine and the watering holes.
Well,
And
we certainly had plenty of people who tilted at windmills as well, which made it
we sure
fiercely
did.
interesting. I don't know if you recall you mentioned TEI, which is one of those. Doug Lannert and Psych being, I think, another
Yeah,
large one, and sort of latterly topic maps, which became almost a
topic map.
cult in
It
itself
did.
as well.
It
Yeah.
did. Yeah, yeah. And then there was the kind of the Ted Nelson Xanadu type stuff going on as well. Transclusion, always one of my favorite words. Yeah, and the perennial debates about or the problems that are associated with things like, tables, equations, the things
Yeah.
that don't yield as easily to the idea of separating content from presentation.
Exactly. Well, the sort of things we like to pretend aren't there if possible. But
Yeah.
it was, I wish going back, if I think there's one thing we did too much of, probably was we did have an early form of tech tribalism. We maybe clung a little too much to ideas about what was orthodox and what was not. And if it was
Mm.
a W3C standard, it was orthodox.
Right.
And if it wasn't, it wasn't, which served us a little well for a time. But we saw in the end, we drove away HTML from the party.
Yeah.
So I do wish it's no different today, but I do wish that I could have perhaps seen a little beyond some of the orthodoxy.
I do remember endless debates about that whole nugget about whether or not to the hierarchical level of like any of those books on the shelf behind you, whether or not the hierarchical level of those things should be encoded in a fully nested way where you know where it starts and you know where it ends, versus the way HTML did it, which was just to basically say, well, there are level headings.
Yeah.
Endless source of debates. But actually brings me to I think one of the major inflection points for me was when I came across. This was after having done some work with TEI and DocBook, if memory serves, coming across the OmniMark programming language. And then the gentleman who set up that company, the Canadian company, I'm blanking on his name right now, but I believe one of the more interesting conference presentations I can remember was where he presented on what I think he called micro document architectures.
Mm.
The terminology hasn't caught on, but essentially what he talked about is what's now known as component content management. The idea that, perhaps there's a level beneath chapter, for example, in a technical book that may be modeling information at a lower level than something like a chapter has got its benefits. What are your memories of all of that? Because that seems to be the Davenport group didn't go there, I don't think.
Well, I think what was distinct is how much what we were asking of the tools were changing.
Yeah.
And we were at a very, in that time, early 2000s, basically, a lot of things were happening. The web was really the place that everybody started to want to publish. And we were also, I think, seeing the rise of open source as well.
Mm.
And, I remember very distinctly being intrigued by a lot of, markup and things like that prior to it. But they was all locked away where you had to pay a fee to even read a standard or,
Right.
many things. And so as it is, a lot of, we were caught up in reinventing badly, but freely.
Right.
So
Right.
I think a lot of fine thinking just went by the wayside in preference of just accessibility to the technology.
Right. Right. Yeah, I mean, there's as you know, there was this series of ISO standards, 8879 from 1986, which was the original SGML. But then associated with that, then there was HyTime. I can't remember the number. but it was an ISO standard for hypermedia, hypertext basically, and then also one for DISL, document style specification language. I can't even remember the full expansion of the acronym now, but they a lot of the thinking that went into those standards did actually pop up, over time in various free to air, open source standards and open source technologies. James Clark immediately springs to mind as being very influential in on the styling side of that anyway, with the genesis of XSLT and XSLFO in DISL. And then you have people like Elliot Kimber, who was involved in the HyTime hypermedia standard, which I think that for me was one of those interesting moments where Tim Berners-Lee, at some point, when thinking about linking A to B, I think concluded that the most sensible thing to do was to let the link break if it wants to.
Right.
And I remember in the reading through all the HyTime materials that there was an awful lot of intellectual horsepower went into trying to basically treat that as a bug, not a feature. And I think it was an absolutely inspired choice in hindsight. That's probably
It was. I think, some of the tension, it's true in computing always, is between people who want to enable users to do stuff and people who want to organize information in an orderly way. And these two goals are not always aligned. And with the web opening up a massive audience, I think it always drags it in favor of people who want to let folks do stuff. So yeah, I I came into all that world looking back at the SGML technologies and HyTime and with respect, but I was happy to leave them relatively opaque to myself, to be honest, because there's so much going on in XML, and RDF at the time also intrigued me a lot. And new things that we were able to do and be a little more pragmatic. RDF was another. It's ironic because a lot of people think it was a lot of wonkery and ivory tower architecture, but it was actually radically much simpler than the kind of SGML architectures for knowledge
Indeed.
around at the time. Just this idea of turn the web into what is effectively a large hash table, and and figure it out from there with a bit of decoration and sniffing around,
right.
Which also is extremely powerful. But
it's funny the way these, as you say, some of these, lots of smart people, think about these things, and then maybe decades later, some of that smart thinking reemerges, in some completely different place, but you can point back to it. I remember, I got a lot out of, say, HyTime, just with the concept of architectural forms. Right? I remember when I read about so-called HyTime architectural forms, that really helped me better understand how you could approach this problem of linking A to B in a cleverer way, or layering semantics on top of a document that didn't have those semantics when it was authored.
right.
So those kind of ideas stick with me, but invariably they pop up in with new language. So the old language gets left behind.
Yes,
I remember HyTime came up with Groves. Was it graphical representation of property values? Which most definitely has not taken off. But if you were to explain the concept to someone in this AI era, they'd probably say something like, "Oh, you mean a knowledge graph?"
Absolutely. I think information management does follow its own laws of physics, and there are certain basic concepts and types and things that we need that won't go away. I think very often, whatever it is, we can get caught up at the boots on the ground level and build architectures on top of that, and then the tool becomes the thing rather than the problem solution becoming the thing, and then we sort of grow up all around it and create architecture. And how many times over the years have you seen Corba reinvented, for instance?
Right. Oh, indeed. Absolutely. Yeah.
We had Web 2, SOAP, and WSDL, and all those We
XML
call
or
them,
PC. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, we call them the WS Death Star kind of
Yeah, WS Death Star. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
sort of things. But yeah, and then now there's JSON RPC, protobufs, whatever. Like, just there are fundamental ideas in computing that we still need.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's every new generation has its own different spin on it. And it's it's kind of
I know, right?
strange. One of the oddities about getting older in this business, is that sense of, oh, here we go again, right? You and I have both been doing this long enough now, to see the patterns, oh, here we go again.
Well, to sort of paraphrase, if when you're 21, you are not wanting to tear down schemas, you have no heart, and if by the time you're 40, you're not building a schema infrastructure, you have no brain. And
Yeah, 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 yeah. I like that. I like that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And what's your whole take on where we've ended up in that whole? Let's just take DocBook as an example. DocBook, to my mind, is what I think of as kind of a monolithic. There's
Hmm.
this work which is maybe in the hundreds of pages, you know, and that work belongs, in a single file or perhaps a small number of files that are joined together, versus the more kind of particle physics approach of saying, exploded into perhaps thousands of little pieces, which is more, I guess, the component content management, maybe the DITA approach, I guess, to, if we're going to stick with names of standards, I guess DocBook, I think, would be the king of the monolithic book school, and DITA would be the king of the atomic physics school of splitting big documents into baby pieces.
Well, I would be a pragmatist. Well, the me now would be a pragmatist, but I think I was a little then. And I was primarily interested in writing either books or articles. Um, and so, unsurprisingly, I come from that. I remember, writing all my O'Reilly books were done by splitting, I think, chapters of the book out into separate XML files and then, building them together to create the whole book.
Hmm.
I think, the we spoke about nesting before, and that was one of the slightly onerous parts of XML, was that
Right.
just the very nature of validating things tended to, and the idea that the DTD was the thing that controlled that validation, tended to lean it towards monolithic
Right.
creations, sort of by default choice of the technology, and that
Yeah.
was tedious, right? But for a lot of applications, you had to explode that. I mean, who thought we would have an instant messenger protocol,
Right.
Jabber, XMPP, based on streaming XML? Because, my God,
Right.
XML have a beginning and an end. How can this be?
Yeah. 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 It is bizarre, all right. The places where it pops up. I think it was who told me, was it Rick Jolliffe? I think had an example of an emergency call out service. I think it is for ambulances or something, where the on the wire message format is XML.
Oh, this actually does remind me. There were a few people who saw beyond this. I don't know if you remember from the field and the conference days, Walter Perry.
I
He
do,
was down,
from New
yeah,
York. Yeah.
yes, and he came from finance, right? The ultimate, most pragmatic group of technologists possible. They just care about wanting getting their information in as fast as possible and exchanging it. And he would argue very hard that it was a waste of time trying to attach a lot of meaning and semantics and get everybody to agree on things
Mm,
with XML in particular. And basically, what you got when you received it was up to you to interpret, and that you were
right.
sort of sovereign over it once you got it. And this was an anathema to all of us at the time,
Yeah.
who
Yeah. Yeah.
we have to have happy standards and agreed ways of
Yeah.
doing things.
Yeah.
Um, and he was, of course, quite right. But
He was. He was. I remember he invited me to speak at a XML users group of New York once, I remember. So I got to spend some time with him. I think his point of view is actually having its day in the sun now, in that, you know, obviously he wasn't thinking about artificial intelligence and, getting machines to understand content quite the way we are today with large language models. But, context is king, right? Is what the all of the AI stuff is telling us,
Mhm.
is that interpretation really is dependent on the context. And in that sense, I think Walter Perry was quite far ahead of us back in those days.
It was, I suppose, sort of an echoing of like Postel's law that he was trying to tell us, but you know, uh, it never quite landed with us because we were so fiercely excited about
Yeah,
all of our standards at the time. But I do. You talked about AI, and ever since we've had before what we call AI now, big data, Hadoop and all that era, which I've been working in largely for the last 10, 15 years. Um, a lot of the things that we were trying to do with markup and the semantic web and generally, encoding knowledge for people were very hamstrung by how hard it was to actually encode things, right? It was artisanal information, you might call it now. It was handcrafted. It cost $20 instead of $2 because putting markup around things
yeah,
or angle brackets were very expensive to create. And you saw that on the web, right? Until Google made metadata an advantage for a brief while, people wouldn't even put title tags in their
right.
HTML pages, like the most basic of encoding. They really didn't care.
Yeah.
Um, so a lot of these things we were trying to do, create universal, reusable bodies of knowledge and so on,
Mm,
were very limited just by that physics, right? That people couldn't label data fast enough. And really what big data techniques, and now it's moving on to AI, have enabled us to do is have the machine do a lot of that classification and
right.
identify the semantics and so on. So we're talking about ideas that have their time. There were a lot of, I think, ideas that we had about information then didn't quite have their time until we could label information
Right.
at,
At
at large.
scale.
And
Yeah,
now we
yeah.
can, yeah, at scale, exactly. So I think in many ways, big data, although it may seem utterly disconnected,
Yeah, yeah.
AI and big data are probably some of the best things to happen for some of the, technologies that we developed a longer time ago.
Oh, indeed, indeed. You were heavily involved in that space, weren't you? Was it the Strata conference? Was that what it was called?
That's right. Yeah. I was there at O'Reilly when we said something new is happening with large. At the time, we didn't identify it as big data straight away, but we saw there were large distributed platforms emerging, right?
Mm,
This was 2010. I think it was, around the time that Netflix, for instance, was just operating completely in the cloud in 2010, and everyone was, mind blown. And so there was a
right.
massive platform. And what was interesting about it ultimately was that it could process data in much more distributed way and bring meaning out of a lot of raw data. And again, all the things that we were doing expensively to classify data and put them beautifully into data warehouses could now be done much more commodity sense, in which you
Right.
didn't even have to schematize. This is actually brings back to Walter Perry, right? What did big data
Yeah.
do? It said, oh, you don't have to design a schema and load your data in the data warehouse. You can say what schema you want at runtime, and this wonderful Hadoop thing will crunch. You can write jobs to crunch and shape terabytes of data into your
Right.
schema on demand rather than it being a priori, which
Right.
led to a lot of flexibility and new things happening. Um, so in many ways, it's been this trend of sort of the opposite of what you think marking things up is. Marking things up is deciding the structure very, 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 very early on.
Mm,
And now AI technologies, big data, whatever you want to call it, makes that a runtime
yeah,
consideration.
you're absolutely right. There was always this tension. Um, ever since I first, came across SGML and started, thinking about, how best to model this information. Right, part of your brain is maybe thinking, purely like in the abstract. What's the best way to
Mhm.
do it, and then sometimes your brain flips into, well, what's the most practical way to do it. And I always found that there was this risk that, So you get hit by the real world like this, all these books behind me on my virtual shelf, right? The more of those that you take down, um, the more outliers you find, the more things you find that don't quite fit your beautiful model, right? So you're kind of constantly chasing your tail, um, hanging on to your beautiful, emotionally attached to this idea that there's a perfect model, and
Yes.
I remember concluding once that there is exactly one perfect model, which is the raw text, and that everything else is a compromise on top of that. Uh, and I've been guilty of it myself, of getting closer and closer to essentially almost like splitting, saying, for example, that, well, if it's narrative text, then everything ultimately is subject, verb, object. I can definitely mark that up, and that will be common, you know. Uh, but now you're down to parts of speech, and it's like, well, okay, so you could model it, but how useful is that, you know? Um,
And then Gen Z comes along and just blows all that up anyway.
so yeah, but as you say now, with the large language models and their ability to understand, context,
Yeah.
means that for the first time ever, we can actually look at making that structure explicit if we need it. Um, but as you say, making it a runtime thing, you don't have to have it there. We don't have to have terabytes of things marked up to word level, but you can have it marked up to word level for a particular context, for a particular task that you might want to do, in a way that doesn't involve the classic old school way of doing it, which was keying it in by hand.
Yes. And the power is amazing in that we can realize it in whichever is the most useful structure
Yeah,
at at the time, right? I mean, it's ridiculous, but you can ask for your annual reports as a screenplay, or
right.
and there's no problem. It's just a form we can do it in. I now notice that Gemini is offering interactive visualizations for things. If you start talking to it about mortgage rates or things like
Right.
that, it'll just drop in easy, casual as anything. Just drop a tool into the conversation where you can tweak some sliders up and down
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
on. So I feel like we're very rich right now, um,
Right.
burning a lot of coal to do it, but we are very
Yeah,
rich.
burning a lot of coal. Yeah, hopefully that gets resolved. We can hope. Um, there are certainly, things that you wouldn't even pursue as a potential strategy for building software these days that you can now
Yeah,
pursue because of some of these new capabilities. It really is it's the most profound change I've noticed in my own brain. Since I wrote my first computer program when I was 16 years of age, I had my biggest transformation of my own brain, I think, a couple of years ago, when I started properly digging in, into the AI stuff, and in particular what it means for the traditional arts of computer programming, which I
yeah,
find just mind blowing. Now you're deep in the middle of all of this, aren't you? This is your new thing. What's your sense of where we are with
it
all
is
of this?
Precambrian explosion. I
Yeah,
I feel,
yeah,
or if you like we're climbing up that steep part of the Gartner hype curve, whatever you want to call it.
right.
But yeah, so yeah, my day job is I work at GitHub, and
Mm,
obviously we have a platform where we both offer AI, agent assisted coding in Copilot, but also we're a platform that is, by virtue of being deeply embedded in open source for the last 15 years,
mm,
kind of the default uh, knowledge exchange for
right.
for source code, right? And you see how Kyle Daigle, the CEO, has tweeted in the past just the exponential rate at which activity on the platform is growing. So
Mm,
it's actually a big challenge just for infrastructure. Something designed for humans 10 years ago needs a lot of work to make it suitable for, tens and hundreds of agents. So we're seeing a lot. We're seeing patterns emerge. I think that's one of the more interesting things now. Where are the paths? So for example, what would be a pattern that people do? You write your code with one LLM, then you switch to another LLM and tell it to be sort of an adversarial
Adversarial. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
reviewer, right, on the code you've just written. So there's lots of things emerging. So it's super exciting and incredibly intense and
Mm,
exhausting. It's the
yeah.
hardest job I've had in my life, but also the most
Mm.
exciting one too.
I would echo that. I find now that um, because the old system was inefficient. It's that inefficiency actually gave me some thinking time that I no longer have, because I can go from let's try this to having a working implementation of let's try this in the
Yeah.
time it takes me to, get up and down with a cup of tea. Um, so the old, I now have to force myself sometimes to say, this is a big decision. I'm going to sleep on this one, even though I could act on it right now
Yes.
because of the new technology. It's everything has speeded up so much. I do find it very intense. There are times for sure that even by the time lunchtime comes around, I feel like I've done a day's work sometimes because I've got all of these different plates being spun at the same time with all of these different agents helping me out. It's incredibly exhilarating, but also mentally very, very taxing, I find.
Well, I'm pretty sure Henry Ford would have told you to go to lunch and have the rest of the day off. Like if you know, 8-hour days were instituted to stop people working 14-hour days. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I do think, yeah, you go through phases, right? And there's certainly, I went through that of just addiction, frankly, just being drawn in so much. It reminded me of my coding in my 20s when, our
Yeah,
bodies would let us code for what, 20 hours a day, and we
right.
didn't have the trappings of a complicated life back then. Nobody would interrupt us, and we would just
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
work and create code. And it's that kind of exhilaration.
Yeah,
Uh, but yeah, then you sort of step back and you start to realize that you can do a lot of meaningless work a lot faster than before, and identifying the meaningful work becomes the fun of it.
right, right. It's definitely changed how I think about one of the things that always attracted me to componentized content um, was this idea that well, whatever it is I'm dealing with, uh, a big slab of content, a library full of stuff. The smaller the individual blocks of content, the more I will be able to throw hardware at it, quote unquote.
Mm.
But when I was initially thinking of throwing hardware at it, I was thinking of, well, I've got three desktop 486 computers or something around here, you know, and, with a little baby Novell network, or maybe, some 3.5-inch floppy disks or whatever. I can spin up a bunch of different CPUs to try and, crank through whatever I was doing with the content, faster. But roll forward to today, and we have such an embarrassment of riches now in terms of what can be done with cloud compute, and now increasingly the ease with which we can basically, without having to get into very, obscure and complicated programming commands, like, I don't know, AWS Lambda or something, right? You can spin up a whole bunch of agents to do things
Yeah.
so much easier than before.
Well, I think to come back to kind of sort of a theme that we've had about the irreducible things, I think it does actually take us back to thinking a little bit about what the best ways to store information is. It's just we've taken this to, it's cheap enough to do that personally now. So if you look at some of the latest things like undericopathy,
Mm,
um, this notion of, okay, a personal wiki is meaningful at this stage once more because you want your agent to build up context on what you're dealing with, and okay, maybe we have a linked directory of a bunch of markdown fragments, now becomes that place. And I'm sure that's not the most powerful way of
right.
doing things. But on the other hand, it's specialized too early, and
Yeah.
agents are actually pretty bad with specialized systems because they don't have enough in their tiny little context brain to understand fully the abstraction. They're a lot more like I was when I was 20, which was the max thing back then on Unix systems was an expert is somebody who can read the man pages faster than you. And
Right.
this is a very good description of an LLM, right? If you can basically run a command with dash dash help. That's how it understands the semantics of the tool.
Yeah.
That kind of puts a cognitive limit on how fancy we can be with the storage. I'm sure there is something better than a directory of Markdown, but at the same time, we're probably not going to go all the way to some of those tools like
Yeah. Yeah.
Omnimart, that we were
Yeah.
talking about before.
Yeah, indeed, indeed, indeed. You mentioned Markdown, which is I just intrigued basically by that's just kind of came out of left field for me, was when I started, looking under the hood of some of these emerging, LLMs and so on, and then seeing this Markdown thing anywhere and saying to myself, "Gosh, how did that happen?" Uh, uh,
Oh,
what's your take on that whole thing?
it's undeniable in its utility.
Mm,
If I look by my computing career, they're like succession of very popular versus better technologies that I have resisted and hated every step of the way and come to build on. JavaScript is probably one of the
right.
first for me like that. JSON, there's a lot of hashtags. Oh my goodness! As somebody who cared about semantic technologies, hashtags
Yeah.
just were ugly and horrible.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, Markdown initially feels like one of those, but its genius, I think, was
Mm,
again finding that sweet spot. It's like a Tim Berners-Lee moment with the hyperlink, right?
yeah.
Where let's say, the common person and a non-computer engineer can just put enough markup into a document to get what they want out of
Yeah.
it. So super sweet spot all came out of blogging, of course. There's not even
Yeah.
one canonical definition of
No.
and it
No.
doesn't
No.
actually matter.
Doesn't seem to matter. Yeah. That's what, when I first started looking at it and then seeing the entire, proliferation of, family of kind of markdown like things. And it struck me that, maybe at some point here, there'd be a need for like a W3C equivalent uh, to try and put some sort of shape on it. But as you say, because these things are, polyglots, at maybe there's maybe the need for standardizing even that is not as important as it would have been before we had the power of the AIs that now produce and consume all of this markdown stuff.
It's true. I mean, there are some. I think there's something that I think tripped us up a lot in XML as well. There's a big difference between data at rest and data in motion.
Hmm.
And when you have a standard everything, both of those things, you can be caught out to think they could apply to both, or you should have the both same standard for a protocol as you do for a
Right.
document. And it's probably a bit of a curse of XML that we tried to do that.
Right.
So
Right.
if you look at the agent infrastructure underneath, right, you have JSON RPC, a well-defined RPC protocol.
Mhm.
You have MCP, which is one of the sort of main ways, particularly like SaaS software, could be accessed by agents. You have an A2A, agent-to-agent protocol, also well-defined, and there's also agent client protocol, which lets you wrap different UIs around the substance of the agent's loop. All of those things are very well defined. They are all about the system in motion, but at the
Right.
edges, we don't care. We can just
Right. Right.
happens to convert it. So where we have to have deterministic operation, we still have the standards.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember back in the early days, I definitely got carried away with myself in the early days. When yeah, it dawned on me that the beauty of schemas. This I'm thinking DTDs here now. So this was back in
Mm.
ISO 8879 era. When it dawned on me that a simple representation of, say, a database table was essentially just a trivial DTD. You know, a DTD that didn't need any concept of recursion or any concept of mixed content. Um, but I do remember then when XML came along. What was it, 1997? I
Yeah.
remember writing an article published on XML.com called RAX, as it was, record oriented XML.
There we go. I remember that. Yes.
And yeah, so with hindsight, that was a bad direction to take. But I suppose it's the space that JSON has filled nicely, I think, for that data in motion case that you mentioned. But I remember it occurred. I had some equation in my head. It was something like, oh, I remember now. It was that if you have a whole bunch of interesting things in your data, and then if you plot a frequency distribution of them, if you get a flat line, it means, well, they've all got name, address, and telephone number. So that tells you
Yes.
you're dealing with classic records. Whereas if you see what looks like an inverse square law, it tells you that you're dealing with something more like text. So like with your average DocBook schema, for example, your average book that's modeled using DocBook is probably using 20% of the markup capabilities that DocBook has, But yeah, that's one of those perennials that just keeps coming around, isn't it? I even saw recently some proposal for a stripped back JSON that would reduce your token count.
I've actually run experiments on that myself because
Okay.
it's really obvious that Jason inflates the token count, and Jason just kind of came along for the ride for the same reason that Markdown. That's Markbook. Let's never
Markbook.
And yeah, I of course use the agent to run the experiment because here I come from, you tell my bias is, I thought, S expressions, that surely has a much better way of doing it. So we sort of ran that, and I think I did some other experiments, and that's not the issue. It's not the encode. It's not whether the brackets are curly or round, or even, we used to, angle brackets, we used to say they're shaped that way because they go down the Ethernet cable faster with a sharp pointy edge.
I like that. Yeah.
But it's about that repetition, particularly for tabular data. JSON issues the field name every goddamn time, right? There's no, so CSV actually is much more efficient,
right
than JSON. And there's actually been, I can't remember the exact name of it now, but you can go out and find several proposals for stripped down versions, and even like little shims you can put either side of your RPC that will convert the JSON into something much lighter weight than agent still understands, that reduces the tokens and so on.
Right.
So we've got to see how that evolves. My gut instinct is, of all the things that people need to optimize right now, there are probably things that offer more bang for the buck than that.
Indeed.
May well, like back to what we were saying about teacups. We're all built on Linux. Remember when Linux came out? It was terrible. Like, we were like, I never want to leave my Solaris behind, please. Like, this is a terrible operating system that's the one we're on. And sort of worse is better continually repeats in our world. So I don't know if that JSON side of things will get fixed for tokens particularly.
Yeah. The other thing that comes along with the tokens that has surprised me a little bit is, we lived through a significant hype cycle to do with cryptocurrencies. I'm sure you're aware of. It just amuses me that one of the prevalent business models in this new era is everyone is inventing their own little fake currency thing, which gets consumed on your platform. So some of these video, AI platforms that I've been using, you put in X dollars and you get, X back of, banana tokens or something, and then as you use, you once your banana count goes below a certain magic number, then, Stripe dings your credit card again for another $10. It's as if we've now gone to this kind of massive, low overhead currency proxies, and kind of measuring value in terms of token counts.
Well, you see it, one of the benefits of perks of my job is tokens, right? I have pretty free access to the models, and you see it as perks. And we're currently in sort of a reckoning here because to date, pretty much everybody has significantly subsidized tokens with, largely VC money, in order to prove things out. And we're at the stage where everything is again, the early stage again technology where everything's expensive, you subsidize it with debt, and you figure out the right way to make it scale later on. And we're at a point now you can see in the public how Anthropic is changing its packages and its pricing and so on, because just the realities
Yeah,
of operating that business are catching up with them, even for people with so much investment. So
right,
yeah,
right.
I be interesting to see how it goes out. I think the free lunches are over.
Yeah,
May have to focus a little more on making sure we're getting genuine value.
yeah,
I
yeah.
just give you one silly little, and I think from that, if you're developing AI right now, the way you get value is still by writing code with an agent, not having the agent do the first class job. So you've got some crystallization of that value that you can then keep and repeat. Um, just one silly little story about that. Uh, piece of technology I developed with an agent last year was a very simple Word and Google Docs to Markdown
Hmm.
converter. Because in my world, we're on GitHub, everybody needs an agent, so everybody needs Markdown, but everyone's writing in Google Docs and Word.
Hmm.
Google Docs, you can turn on this feature where you can have copy as Markdown come in the menu, right? But my company's inside Microsoft. Word doesn't have that that feature.
Okay.
So I wrote this as a browser extension, and not too proud to say that actually Claude Code did most of the from
Right.
Copilot the writing. So I've got that value now, and it's repeatable. It's in the app stores and whatnot. But I was
Hmm.
trying to say to like this technical community at work, hey, use this extension. You'll find it really handy. Now we're in Microsoft land and you don't have this. And everyone's saying, yeah, but I can just upload my doc file to the agent and say, give me this as Markdown, please.
Yeah.
And like the default way to do something, that must be 10,000 times more expensive, literally,
Yeah.
than using a tool. But the convenience of it has everybody,
Yeah.
burning forests to walk to the
Yeah.
end of the street. It's
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
can't
Yeah.
that can't stay.
Yeah. It's such an interesting time to be alive, really is. If you're in this kind of field, um, part of me thinks, we're in the glory days of test-driven development and what used to be called extreme programming, or
Mm.
pair programming, right? Because we can all now pair program, and arguably we all should, right?
Oh
And
yeah,
the agents should be helping us out. It now makes sense to take a really strong position on test-driven development, because it's now completely plausible to have 10,000 tests, right? Because you can get the
yes,
AIs to help you even with adversarial testing strategies and so on. If you set yourself up right, things that wouldn't have been economically viable if you had to in any way handcraft that test suite are now economically viable. So that's the part of me that thinks that ultimately this is going to lead to better code. But then on the other end of it, you've got the fact that you can just set up these try-fail loops with agents where you can basically say, just keep going round and round and round, trying things until something works. Which seems like a good way of burning forests, unfortunately.
exactly. And you have your extreme examples of that, the Steve Yegi stuff. I think it's called Gas Town, which is just, if you've never read about that, go and take a look. It's just to the limit. He must have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars to just drop on this stuff.
Mm,
But I'm with you. Like it, I once described LLMs as like having an unlimited supply of interns at marginal cost. And so
right.
all the things you would do if you had all those interns and they were happy just to sit there writing tests for you, as you say, you can do it. You can't expect too much of them, but they will do that.
Yeah, yeah.
I think at our particular stage in careers, anyone who's gone through doing everything by hand has built up all the knowledge, understands how
Right.
systems interact. We have an amazing enablement that we never had before.
Yeah.
I haven't had the chance to talk to like programmers younger in their career and understand what
Right.
they. I would be fascinated because for me it's like a miracle.
Yeah.
Um, but if you're earlier on in that, I don't know. I don't know how you view it.
No, no, I'm with you. I I've had a kind of a renaissance. I put myself out to pasture from a programming perspective, a couple of years ago. And now I find myself like firmly back in the saddle and, coding without coding on a regular basis, because I'm using all of the, agents to help me. But essentially what I'm doing is I'm bringing, because I've been doing it since I've been 16, I've built up a whole bunch of tacit knowledge about, the kinds of things that can go wrong.
Yeah.
When you develop gut instincts about, you know, ways of, do I try strategy A or strategy B? Well, I don't know which one's going to work, but strategy A feels right for reasons that I can't articulate, and you go with it because you've been doing it since you were 16. But I do worry that the generation that's coming up now just hasn't had the hard yards, the hard decades, of programming at that lower level. But then the other side of me, remembers that, I was probably I was one of the last generations, I guess, of programmers who started out by writing assembly language and then moved to programming languages like C. But modern day folks, I don't think, suffer from the fact that they never programmed in assembly. So I don't know.
No, although, I mean, it's all bets are off, Sean, because the other thing that's commoditized super rapidly is hardware, and now you can buy these little ESP32 development kits, build all kinds of interesting stuff that you and I, it took many more years for me to, as a teenager, save up the money for the hardware I needed than
Yeah,
the
yeah.
$50 ESP32 development kit that's available right now. So there's no particular telling. One thing that is fun, though, I think, is because so much of the knowledge that's in the agents owes very much to both markup and the web, the fact it exists in the first place, and open source, which is Unix. So everything that we have built in our entire career is accessible and useful to us in a new, very leveraged way. I think we were headed before, a couple of years ago, we were heading to a very sort of desperate place, I think, that felt a lot like the 80s, where SaaS platforms have begun to lock down information, the ways of accessing them at scale, and that you nickel and dime, like, oh, $100, even as a consumer, right? $100 subscription for this over there, then this knowledge tool for here, a handy $900 over to Adobe for each year.
Right.
And now, so I had all those things. Some really nice platforms like Todoist, but since the beginning of the year, I've just clawed all that back. They all had APIs. I've got the data out. It's all now sitting in some Emacs wonk org files, right, instead of Markdown. But it's all there. I've regained a lot of sovereignty over my technological universe that I never had before. So if we went back time, and maybe the kids coming up actually feel exactly like we did when we were kids coming up now.
Yeah. Such a bizarre. I'm in exactly the same boat. There's times when I now say to myself, "Gosh, I wish I had for the week's work that is ahead of me. I wish I had a tool that did X, and now I can just go and vibe code X, and then throw it away." It's like
it's highly personal, right? And this is I think the tension with markup, which is highly impersonal. It's a cathedral of structure where you must worship, and like SAS, it tries to please everybody, and you have 80% of it you'll never use because of all the corner cases. Now we just need exactly the right tool for the job, exactly the right structure for the job, and it doesn't matter if it only serves Monday's purpose.
Yeah, indeed. Fascinating time to be doing this kind of work. Well, it's been fascinating talking to you, Ed. We could talk for another 10 hours. We wouldn't run out of stuff to talk about, I'm sure. Greatly appreciate you taking the time to talk today. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks. It's been great. Thanks for having me.